make every problem dissipate between our two households, yet knowing no such thing was possible. He smiled sadly at our hands, and shook his head.
Yep.
He chuckled darkly, confusing me, and forcing my eyebrows to pull together until he dropped my hand, and finally darted his distraught eyes back up to mine.
I fucking love you too.
And then he was gone, and my hand was cold as I crossed my arms over my chest, and stared out the window, toward the Cullen house. The sharp, cold breeze whipped through the yard, sending a shiver down my spine, as the lilac curtains at my side swayed in tandem with my tangled hair. Everything seemed comfortingly silver under the moonlight outside my window. Until the edges of a large cloud slowly passed over the bright, full moon, in the dark sky, bathing everything in black and obscure as I closed my window swiftly, and returned to the safe cover of my blue blankets. I never slept, of course, and was out of my room before the sun could fully rise. The kitchen looked warm and inviting as I began making breakfast. Still sour and dismal, but needing the distraction rather badly. I spent my entire day there, with no interruptions from the other occupants of the house. I wasn't entirely sure if I was being avoided, or merely being given my space. It didn't really matter to me, because I was glad for it either way. I wasn't going to be polite company, and I was already tired. So I cooked pointless things that would probably never get eaten, but I packed most of it away. I figured I could take it to Edward at school the next day. The thought made me smile. He was probably very hungry. The house was quiet for the most part, so imagine my extreme surprise when I heard an argument between Esme and Alice floating in from the living room. The closer I got to the room, the more surprised and curious I became. My name was being said, and huffed from Alice as I stalked down the hallway, and stopped just short of being visible.
She's 17, Mom. You can't just forbid her from having a boyfriend.
Alice protested loudly. I put my back flat against the wall, and smiled down at my bare toes. Alice was siding with me and Edward. The thought was enough to actually lift my spirits as I stood and eavesdropped on their argument. Esme didn't agree.
I'm not forbidding her from having a boyfriend, Alice.
She insisted softly, attempting to placate Alice with her voice, and likely her sweet smile. I could almost imagine Alice's eyebrows rising to her forehead, like they always did when she got flustered.
I'm just forbidding her from having Edward as a boyfriend,
she clarified curtly. Alice huffed and my smile fell as I hastily made my way back to the safety of the kitchen. If I heard anything being said about Edward, I wouldn't be able to stop myself from defending him and causing more trouble. When dinner time approached, there was a knock on the front door. I was curious, but I remained in the kitchen as I finished up some last-minute weekend homework. Remaining occupied, and dreading 9 o'clock for the first time in months. I could hear talking and laughter from the living room. Laughter that sounded much like Dr. Cullen's. Then I was angry. Slamming my pencil down and swinging my head to the direction of the voices. Esme was with Carlisle, and it just didn't seem fair that everyone else could have a relationship. A sexual relationship. Yet I was forbidden from being with Edward. Treated like some fragile child that couldn't make her own decisions. Treated differently. I seized at my school books as they left the house. And when Alice entered the kitchen and pulled up a stool in front of mine, I couldn't hold it in. It isn't fair, I screeched, throwing my hands up in the air, and taking her by surprise, as she flinched slightly from the volume of my voice. Traitor tears freckled my eyes as I blinked them back angrily. She sighed, and shook her head, making her black hair bounce from side to side as she picked up my pencil.
It's not,
she agreed, sliding a piece of paper out and doodling on it.
Can you believe her and Dr. Cullen?
Her eyes never left the paper as the pencil drew sloppy circles. Oh right. I had forgotten that it wasn't as obvious to other people. You didn't know? I asked sadly, tilting my head, and pushing back my own problems long enough to hear hers. I figured it must have been hard for her to see that. Her mother with another man. She giggled, surprising me.
Oh, I knew.
She quirked an eyebrow and smiled at me.
I was just shocked they were finally making it public.
She snickered with another shake of her head. I rolled my eyes and rose from the stool, deciding that we were eating supper alone. But I was thankful that I wouldn't have to deal with Esme again for the night. I briefly considered sneaking out, thinking that Alice might cover for me as she sat in her stool and relayed to me various clues that had tipped her off to Esme and Dr. Cullen's relationship. But I stayed put, hoping my honesty and good behavior would give me bonus points, and if I was very lucky, earn some of the trust back I had already lost. I would use that trust to convince her I wasn't a child anymore. To convince her that I was mature enough to decide for myself whether or not Edward was good for me, and even though it was a long shot of the farthest kind, maybe that trust could eventually get us the sleep back. I made cookies at 8 that night, just as Esme returned. We didn't speak, and as I bagged up the poppy-dipped darkness cookies, I dreaded the coming night and all of the black and blue that awaited me behind the door to my bedroom.
Edward's point of view. Carlisle and I were no longer on speaking terms. The feeling was mutual. Things were said in that study that both of us were being really fucking bitter about. He shouldn't have been in my room that night. The door was locked, and I knew it was because I was always so fucking careful to do it every evening before Bella came. Which meant that he used a key to get in, which confused the shit out of me, but he refused to tell me what he was doing. Always telling me it was his house, or just changing the subject swiftly. I ended up using the dickhead tactic, throwing his secret relationship with Esme in his face, and loving how he got suddenly defensive about his privacy, as an adult. He emphasized the use of the word adult to justify his constant prodding into my own privacy. It didn't justify shit. Then, he began examining my relationship with Bella right in front of me, and the shit that came out of his mouth was so untrue and just wrong. Unfortunately, the more he spoke, the more they began making sense to me, and the more I began irrationally questioning everything. It pissed me off, and after much shouting and various expletives, I stormed out of the study and seeped in my room alone. The bloodstain mocked me relentlessly from my bed until I got fed up and ripped the comforter off angrily. So many things ate away at my thoughts while I stewed for the remainder of the day. If Bella was okay, all the shit that Carlisle had questioned, the fact that I couldn't sleep and I was already tired from the lack of sleep the previous night, and what Esme probably thought, well, I knew what it looked like to everyone else. Bella was innocent and I was the asshole. It would seem like I took advantage of her condition. Like, because I was the only one who could touch her, I just grabbed that shit and ran with it. Like I was the asshole manipulator that I had always feared being from the beginning of this whole fucked up situation. I doubt that even hearing the disagreement from Bella herself could convince anyone else otherwise. I smoked outside on my balcony. And it had been so fucking long since I had a cigarette that it felt good and relaxing, and made me beautifully lightheaded. But when the night fell, I needed to see my girl. It was the first night we had spent apart since Phoenix, and I just had to know she was okay before I could even think of relaxing. I knew it was risky, and if I got caught it would just make shit so much worse, but I couldn't wait until school on Monday to ease my fears. So I snuck out, down the lattice that my girl would usually climbing at that exact moment, and over to the Brandon house. The kitchen was empty as I peered through the window, so I figured she'd be in her room. But I had never been in her room, so I had used the process of elimination to find the right window. And I was so fucking relieved when I got the right one on the first try. She was scared, I could tell, being locked away in the dark room that she seemed to loathe. And she looked like shit with her hair all over the place, and it was obvious that she hadn't changed since she left my house that morning. I covered the closet door for her, and that fucking wardrobe was so heavy that I glared at it the entire time she was in the bathroom. But she still held me and loved me, and I was fucking laughing at Carlisle inside my head as she kissed me and made me smile. He didn't know shit about me and my girl. I spent the night alone in my room, still seething but happy that Bella was okay. Esme was really putting her foot down, not even allowing her to use the kitchen at night. which seemed really fucking extreme to me, like cooking was so debauched. It wasn't fair to her. She didn't do anything wrong, and now she was being forced to be in a place that scared her instead of being safe with me. I began pondering over the possibility of sneaking out myself every night, to go to her room, to keep her in my arms and make her feel safe in her own bed. As if he knew just what I had been thinking, that morning Carlisle had the lattice torn down from the back side of the house. I pulled my curtains back, and glared down at him from where he stood in the middle of the yard. Now not only could no one sneak in, but I couldn't sneak out either. Motherfucker. He was covering all of his bases, and not even glancing towards the direction of my window, as he watched the lattice crash to the ground unceremoniously. I spent my day alone in my room again. I was hungry. Fucking starving. But there was no way in hell I was going to risk passing him in the hallway. I didn't want this. I didn't want to fucking be here, in this house with this man that was holding me back from the one thing that could bring me peace. In this whole fucking town that looked at me like I was this asshole. I was sick of it. The scrutiny and the reputation that I probably deserved, but fucking hated nonetheless. I wanted to leave. I wanted to get out of this house and this town, and just be away from it all. But I would never leave my girl. She kept me in my room that day, as the rage swelled inside of me towards Carlisle and as me and the entire population of Forks in general. She was the reason. She was always the reason. It became painfully obvious to me that it was us against them. But I told myself I could handle it. Tough it out for as long as I needed. I had been through so much worse, really. Daddy C was a fucking saint compared to some of my past foster parents. Some like to hit with fists and feet. Ruled by fear. I could handle that kind of shit because physical pain never meant much to me, but Carlisle liked to get inside of my head. Plant little inklings of doubt in my own beliefs. It wasn't painful, but it pissed me off. I later discovered that Carlisle and Esme went out that evening. Publicly. He went to her house and picked her up right in front of Brandon, and I was hoping that she blew a fucking fuse when she found out. They were only doing it to prove a point. To make their actions more moral, or some shit. To give us one less thing to use against them. Fuck it. I could care less what those two did, and I had to battle with my every instinct that night not to go back to my girl's window and see her after I knew they were both gone. It was one of the worst nights I've ever had. The first night I hadn't seen her or touched her in months. By Monday morning, I was tired. Really fucking tired as I drove to pick up Jez. I could tell when he got in the car I didn't need to explain anything. I figured Alice must have already filled him in because the look on his face was sympathetic and all fucking full of careful pity that I didn't want. "Sorry, dude," he muttered as he settled into his seat. He didn't look at me and I didn't say anything as I drove us to the school. Most of me was still pissed off about it. Pissed off at everyone. Another part of me was just tired. But there was another part that was just anxious to get into the parking lot and finally have my girl with me again. Then when I finally whipped into the space next to the Porsche and got out, I realized that Alice fucking knew we got caught. And I had never been in worse danger of castration than I was at that moment. Deflowering her cousin and looking like the asshole manipulator as I leaned against my car and stared at the yellow Porsche in front of me both longingly and dreadfully. The tint on the windows obscured her exact facial expression as Bella's door opened, and she stepped out. My heart fucking sank when I saw her because she was tired too and her eyes were already bloodshot. But then they met mine, and she looked so fucking happy to see me that I couldn't help but smile at her as she flung herself into my open arms. Her hood was up, and even though I knew we were at school and it wasn't lunch yet, I didn't give a shit. I pulled the hood down and freed her hair, sweeping it off her neck as I encircled her in my arms. She smelled so fucking good as I buried my face in her neck and just inhaled all of her. She was hugging my neck so hard that she was nearly hanging from me, her feet just barely grazing the pavement as I held her close. We just stood there for a while, and I was hoping maybe Jazz was containing Alice, and her anger as I enjoyed the feeling of Bella's body pressed completely against me. I was terrified to lift my face out of the warmth of her neck, and realize the rest of the world actually existed.